The rain hammered against the cabin windows like angry fists, but Marcus Whitfield barely heard it anymore. 20 years of storms had taught him that nature's fury was nothing compared to the silence that followed. He sat at his kitchen table, carving another wooden bird from a block of pine, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision. The pile of finished carvings beside him had grown tall over the years. Robins, hawks, sparrows, all destined for the dusty shelves that lined his walls. Birds that would never fly, made by a man who had forgotten how to soar. The knock came at 11:47 p.m. 3 sharp raps that cut through the storm like gunshots. Marcus froze, his knife suspended mid-carve. In 20 years of self-imposed exile, no one had ever knocked on his door after dark. Hell, no one had knocked on his door at all. "Please," came a voice from beyond the wooden barrier, young, desperate female. "We need help. My sister. She's having the baby now." Marcus set down his knife with trembling fingers. The voice belonged to a world he'd left behind, a world of human connection he'd sworn never to rejoin. But as lightning illuminated his windows and thunder shook the foundation, he realized that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. What happened next would shatter 2 decades of carefully constructed isolation and force Marcus to confront the demons that had driven him into the wilderness. Because when 3 sisters arrive at your door in the middle of a storm, carrying more than just the promise of new life, even the most broken man must choose between the safety of solitude and the terrifying possibility of redemption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crept through the dense canopy of Douglas firs, casting long shadows across the forest floor where Marcus Whitfield had built his sanctuary of solitude. 20 years ago, he'd driven his battered pickup truck up the winding mountain road, carrying nothing but a toolbox, a guilty conscience, and enough supplies to last a month. The month had stretched into 2 decades. His cabin sat nestled in a clearing he'd carved from the wilderness with his own hands, a testament to what a man could accomplish when running from something stronger than death itself. The structure was solid, built from the bones of trees he'd felled, chinked with mud and moss, roofed with cedar shakes that had weathered to silver grey. It was large enough for one, perfect for hiding, and completely invisible from the nearest road, which was exactly how Marcus preferred it. The nearest neighbor lived 17 miles down the mountain in Pine Ridge, a town so small it barely qualified as a dot on most maps. Marcus had been there exactly 4 times in 20 years, once for emergency medical supplies when he'd nearly severed his thumb with a chainsaw, twice for critical repairs he couldn't manage with salvaged materials, and once when a wildfire had threatened to consume everything within 50 miles. Each visit had reminded him why he'd chosen isolation over civilization. Marcus William Whitfield had once been a different man entirely. At 35, he'd been a successful contractor in Seattle, married to Rebecca Ann Whitfield, father to twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, who just celebrated their 8th birthday. He'd built houses for Microsoft executives, Boeing engineers, and tech entrepreneurs who paid him handsomely for custom work. His crew had respected him, his wife had loved him, and his daughters had thought he hung the moon. The accident had changed everything in the span of 17 seconds. He'd been driving home from a job site on a Friday evening, eager to surprise the girls with tickets to the circus that was coming to town. The rain had been falling steadily, turning the road slick, but Marcus had driven these streets 1,000 times. He knew every curve, every pothole, every traffic light timing by heart. The other driver had been 19 years old, high on methamphetamines, and driving a stolen Camaro at 80 miles per hour through a residential neighborhood. Marcus never saw him coming. When Marcus woke up 3 days later in Harborview Medical Center, the doctor's words had fallen on him like stones. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitfield. We did everything we could, but the internal injuries were too severe. Your wife died on impact. The girls didn't suffer. 20 years later, Marcus could still recite those words verbatim, could still feel the exact weight of them settling into his chest like broken glass. The drunk kid had walked away with minor scratches. Marcus had been left with nothing but a scar across his forehead and a guilt that ate him alive from the inside out. The funeral had been a blur of caskets, flowers, and people who offered condolences that felt like salt in an open wound. Rebecca's sister Patricia had tried to convince him to stay, to let her help him through the grief. Friends had called, colleagues had visited, therapists had been recommended. Everyone had wanted to help Marcus Whitfield rejoin the world of the living. But Marcus had learned a terrible truth in that hospital room. Some men aren't meant to survive the complete destruction of everything they love. Some men are meant to disappear. So he'd sold the house where Rebecca had tended her garden, and the girls had played on the swing set he'd built with his own hands. He'd liquidated his business, paid off every debt, and divided what remained between charities for children and victims of drunk drivers. Then he'd bought 40 acres of mountain wilderness and vanished as completely as a man could vanish in the modern world. The first winter had nearly killed him. His carpentry skills had served him well in building the cabin, but he'd known nothing about hunting, trapping, or preserving food. He'd lost 30 pounds and spent Christmas Day, 1994, eating the last of his canned beans while snow piled 4 feet deep outside his door. But he'd survived, and survival had become its own form of purpose. Over the years, he'd learned to live off the land with a dedication that bordered on obsession. He'd mastered the art of hunting deer and elk, had learned to identify every edible plant within 50 miles, could set snares that never failed, and traps that could catch anything from rabbits to black bears. His garden produced enough vegetables to last through the winter, supplemented by wild berries, nuts, and roots that most people wouldn't recognize as food. He'd also learned to avoid people with the skill of a ghost. When hikers occasionally wandered too close to his territory, Marcus could disappear into the forest so completely that they'd pass within 10 feet of him without knowing he existed. When hunters came through during deer season, he'd track them from the shadows, ensuring they stayed clear of his cabin and his carefully maintained trails. The isolation had become more than a choice. It had become a necessity. Human contact brought pain, memories, questions he couldn't answer. Better to live alone with the trees and the animals and the constant, familiar ache of loss than to risk feeling hope again. His daily routine had remained unchanged for 15 years. Rise at dawn, check the traps and snares he'd set the previous evening, tend the garden during growing season, or maintain his equipment during the winter months. Hunt when meat was needed, fish when the streams were, running high, spend his afternoons working wood, carving the birds that had become his only form of artistic expression. Cook a simple meal, read by lamplight from the collection of books he'd accumulated through rare trips to town, sleep when darkness fell. D'accord. Carvings had started as simple whittling to keep his hands busy during long winter evenings. But over the years, they'd evolved into something approaching art. Marcus had always been good with his hands, but isolation had refined his skills to an almost supernatural level. Each bird was unique, carved from different types of wood he'd harvested from the forest: oak, maple, cherry, walnut, pine. He captured every detail: the curve of a robin's breast, the sharp intelligence in a hawk's eye, the delicate pattern of feathers on a sparrow's wing. The shelves of his cabin held, hundreds of them now, a wooden menagerie that watched him with glassy eyes as he went about his solitary existence. Sometimes, late at night, when the loneliness felt like a living thing clawing at his chest, Marcus would talk to them. He'd tell them about Rebecca's laugh, about Emma's freckles, about Sophie's habit of reading the same book 17 times. until she could recite it from memory. The birds never answered, which was exactly what Marcus expected from a world that had already taken everything worth having. His reflection in the cabin's single mirror showed the toll that 20 years of isolation had taken. His dark hair had gone completely grey, his face lined with weather and solitude. His body remained strong from constant physical labor, but his eyes had changed the most. They'd once been warm brown, the kind of eyes that smiled even when his mouth didn't. Now they were flat, distant, the eyes of a man who'd seen too much and felt too little. The town of Pine Ridge knew him only as the hermit, if they thought of him at all. The few people who'd glimpsed him during his rare visits described a tall, bearded mountain man who paid in cash, spoke in monosyllables, and disappeared back into the forest like smoke. Children dared each other to hike toward his supposed location, but none had ever made it far enough to find him. Dr. Amanda Chen, the town's only physician, had been the closest thing Marcus had to human contact over the years. She was the one who'd treated his chainsaw injury, the one who'd sold him emergency antibiotics when infection had set in, the one who'd never asked questions he couldn't answer. She was also the one who'd probably be surprised to learn that the hermit she'd patched up had once been a suburban father who'd coached Little League and built tree houses. Marcus had trained himself not to think about what his life might have been. Emma would be 28 now, probably married, maybe with children of her own. Sophie would be working somewhere, pursuing whatever dreams 8-year-olds have when they're not being buried in small caskets. Rebecca would be 55, her blonde hair probably showing silver, her green eyes still bright with the intelligence that had first attracted him 27 years ago when they'd met in a college literature class. But that was another life. Another man's story. Marcus Whitfield had died in that car crash along with his family. What lived in the mountain cabin was something else entirely, a ghost who carved wooden birds and counted the days by the phases of the moon. The storm that brought the three sisters had been building for days, the kind of late spring weather system that could dump 6 inches of snow at higher elevations while flooding the valleys below. Marcus had prepared as he always did, checking his supplies, securing loose items around the cabin, adding extra wood to the pile beside his stove. He'd eaten a simple dinner of venison stew and cornbread, then settled into his evening routine of carving. The piece in his hands was going to be a mourning dove, the wood a piece of white pine that had been struck by lightning the previous summer. The irony of a hermit carving a mourning dove wasn't lost on him, but Marcus had long ago stopped analyzing the psychological implications of his art. The first knock had been tentative, so soft he'd almost convinced himself it was a branch blown against the wall by the wind. The second had been more insistent. By the third, he could no longer pretend it was anything other than what it was. The sound that marked the end of 20 years of perfect isolation. Standing in his kitchen with his carving knife in hand, Marcus felt something shift in the air around him, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside time seemed suspended, balanced on the edge of a choice he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The voice came again, clearer this time, cutting through the wind. "Please, if anyone's in there, we need help. My sister's having contractions, and the bridge washed out. We can't get to town." Marcus closed his eyes and felt 20 years of carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. Somewhere in the darkness beyond his door were 3 women in trouble. And despite everything he'd done to separate himself from the world of human suffering, he was apparently still human enough to care. His hand moved toward the door handle, then stopped. Opening that door would change everything, would let the outside world flood back into the sanctuary he'd built from grief and determination. But the alternative was letting 3 strangers suffer in the storm while he hid behind wood and 20 years of guilt. Marcus Whitfield took a deep breath, set down his carving knife, and reached for the door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through 20 years of silence. Marcus found himself face to face with three women who looked like they'd stepped out of a nightmare, soaked to the bone, shivering, and desperate in a way that made his chest tighten with unwelcome recognition. The eldest stood in front, probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair plastered to her skull and fierce green eyes that reminded him painfully of Rebecca. She held herself with the rigid posture of someone trying not to collapse, her arm wrapped protectively around a younger woman whose swollen belly left no doubt about her condition. "Thank God," the eldest breathed, her voice cracking with relief. "We saw your lights through the trees. I'm Catherine Morrison, and this is my sister Julia. She gestured helplessly at the pregnant woman, whose face was pale as moonlight and twisted in pain. The third sister stood slightly behind them, younger than the others, maybe early 20s, with dark hair and wide brown eyes that darted nervously between Marcus and the storm raging behind them. She clutched a soaked canvas bag against her chest, like a shield. "Please," Catherine continued, her words tumbling over each other. "The bridge on Highway 7 washed out about 3 hours ago. We were trying to get Julia to the hospital in Spokane, but now we're stranded. She's not due for another 2 weeks, but the contractions started right after we got stuck." Julia doubled over with a low moan that cut through Marcus like a blade. He'd heard that sound before, 20 years ago, when Rebecca had been in labor with the twins. The memory hit him with such force that he had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. "How far apart are the contractions?" The words came out of his mouth before he could stop them, medical knowledge surfacing from a life he'd tried to forget. He'd been present for both his daughters' births, had taken childbirth classes with Rebecca, had read every book on labor and delivery he could find. "About 4 minutes now," the youngest sister spoke for the first time, her voice barely audible over the storm. "They were 10 minutes apart when we left Missoula, but they're getting closer." Marcus looked at Julia, really looked at her, and saw exhaustion mixed with terror. She was young, maybe 25, with blonde hair and delicate features that would have been beautiful if they weren't contorted with pain. Her clothes were expensive but practical, not the kind of outfit someone wore unless they were traveling far from home. "Come in," Marcus heard himself say, stepping back from the doorway. "All of you, get out of this weather." They stumbled into his cabin like refugees, bringing with them the scent of rain and something else, the sharp tang of fear that seemed to cling to their skin. Catherine immediately began stripping off Julia's soaked jacket, while the youngest sister, Marcus realized he still didn't know her name, set down her bag and looked around the cabin with undisguised amazement. "I'm sorry," Catherine said, helping. Julia, to the old leather couch that dominated Marcus's living area. "We didn't even ask your name. I'm Catherine Morrison. This is Julia Harrison. She kept her married name. And this is our baby sister, Nicole Morrison. We're from Missoula originally, but Julia lives in Portland now." Marcus nodded stiffly, his social skills rusty from disuse. "Marcus Whitfield. He gestured around the cabin. "This is where I live." Nicole's eyes were wide as she took in the hundreds of wooden birds lining the shelves, the hand-hewn furniture, the obvious signs that someone had been living completely off the grid for years. "How long have you been up here?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity despite their circumstances. "A while," Marcus answered curtly, then immediately felt guilty for his rudeness. These women were in crisis, and his personal history wasn't relevant to their immediate needs. "Julia, I need to ask you some questions. Is this your first baby?" Julia managed a weak smile between contractions. "Yes. My husband David wanted to be here, but he's deployed overseas. Army. He's supposed to be back next month." Her face crumpled slightly. "He's going to miss everything." Catherine sat beside her sister and took her hand. We were driving from Missoula to Portland, so Julia could stay with me until David gets back. The baby wasn't supposed to come this early, but apparently babies don't follow schedules. Another contraction hit Julia with visible force, and Marcus found himself moving without conscious thought. He knelt beside the couch, his weathered hands hovering uncertainly over her swollen belly. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded, he pressed his palm gently against her abdomen. The contraction was strong, stronger than it should be for someone who supposedly wasn't in active labor. Marcus had attended enough births to recognize the signs. Julia wasn't having false labor pains or Braxton Hicks contractions. This baby was coming whether they were ready or not. "How long since your water broke?" he asked. Julia's eyes widened with embarrassment. "About an hour ago, in the car. I thought maybe I'd just, lost control because of the panic." Marcus met Catherine's gaze over Julia's head and saw his own concern reflected there. An hour was significant, especially combined with the intensity and frequency of the contractions. "We need to get her comfortable and assess the situation," he said, surprised by how easily he slipped into a take-charge mode he hadn't used in decades. "Nicole, what's in the bag?" Nicole opened her canvas bag and began pulling out items. "I grabbed everything I could think of from Julia's hospital bag before we ran from the car. Clean towels, some clothes, her medical records, snacks." She trailed off, looking helpless. Marcus stood and began pacing, his mind racing through options. The storm showed no signs of abating, which meant the bridge would remain impassable for hours, possibly days. Julia was in active labor with what appeared to be a precipitous delivery. The kind where babies arrived faster than expected, often with complications. "Catherine," he said, "tell me about your sister's pregnancy. Any complications, high blood pressure, diabetes, problems with the baby's positioning?" Catherine shook her head. "Everything's been textbook perfect. Her last appointment was 3 days ago, and the doctor said she was healthy as a horse. The baby was head down, good weight, no concerns at all." Julia let out another moan. This, one deeper and more primal than the others. Marcus recognized the sound. It meant things were progressing rapidly. "I need to examine her," Marcus said bluntly. "I'm not a doctor, but I've delivered babies before." It was a lie, or at least a half-truth. He'd been present for births, had read extensively about emergency deliveries, but he'd never actually been the primary attendant. "You're a midwife?" Nicole asked hopefully. "No," Marcus said carefully, "but I have experience with medical emergencies, and right now, I'm what you've got." The three sisters exchanged glances, communicating in that wordless way that family members do. Finally, Catherine nodded. "What do you need us to do?" Marcus looked around his cabin, mentally cataloguing supplies. He had clean sheets, plenty of hot water, basic first aid supplies, and a bottle of whiskey for sterilization if needed. What he didn't have was any of the medical equipment that would make this safe. "First, we need to make her as comfortable as possible. Catherine, help me move Julia to the bedroom. The mattress will be better than the couch. Nicole, I need you to put every pot I have on the stove and get water boiling. We're going to need a lot of hot water and clean cloths." As they worked to relocate Julia, Marcus found himself studying the three women more carefully. Despite their obvious family resemblance, they were remarkably different. Catherine had the bearing of someone used to taking charge, probably the oldest, definitely the one others looked to for guidance. Her wedding ring caught the lamplight as she helped support Julia, and Marcus noticed the way she moved with the confidence of someone who'd faced crises before. Julia, even in labor, had a gentleness about her that reminded Marcus of Rebecca. Her blonde hair was the same shade, and she had the same habit of biting her lower lip when concentrating on something painful. The similarities were unsettling, but Marcus pushed the memories away. This woman needed help, not his baggage. Nicole was clearly the baby of the family, but there was steel underneath her uncertainty. She followed Marcus's instructions without question, moving around his kitchen with surprising efficiency for someone who'd never been there before. "Where are you from originally?" Marcus asked Catherine as they settled Julia onto his bed. It was partially to distract from the intimate nature of what they were doing, but also because something about their accents suggested they weren't Montana natives. "Boston," Catherine replied. "Dad was military, so we moved around a lot when we were kids, but we always considered Massachusetts home. Julia moved west for college and stayed. Nicole's finishing her degree at the University of Montana, and I ended up back east after I got married." "What brings you all together now?" Catherine's face softened as she looked at Julia. "Julia's husband. Deployed 6 months ago. She's been trying to be brave about doing this alone, but when the due date started getting close, Nicole and I decided she shouldn't have to face it by herself. We were going to stay in Portland until David got back." Julia grabbed Catherine's hand as another contraction hit. "I'm scared," she whispered, and Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. The vulnerability in her voice was achingly familiar. "You're going to be fine," Catherine said firmly. "All of us are going to be fine." Marcus wished he felt as confident as Catherine sounded. The truth was, childbirth was inherently dangerous, especially when you were miles from the nearest hospital and dependent on a hermit who hadn't spoken to another human being for more than 10 minutes in the past 5 years. Nicole returned with news that the water was heating, and she'd found his supply of clean towels. "Is there anything else we need?" she asked. "I could try to hike down to the road and see if I can get a cell phone signal." "Absolutely not," Marcus said sharply. "The trail is treacherous in good weather, and in this storm you'd be lucky to make it 100 yards without getting lost or injured. We're on our own until this weather passes." The finality of his words seemed to settle over the room like a blanket. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. But inside Marcus's cabin, 3 strangers had suddenly become his responsibility in the most fundamental way possible. Julia looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of fear and trust that made his throat tight. "Have you really delivered babies before?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I've been present for births, and I know what needs to be done. You're in good hands." Another half-truth, but delivered with enough conviction that Julia's shoulders relaxed. "Slightly." Catherine squeezed her sister's hand. "We're all here with you, Jules. You're not alone." As Marcus watched the 3 women support each other through the crisis, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. The weight of being needed by someone other than himself. It was terrifying and oddly exhilarating at the same time. Julia's next contraction was stronger than the previous ones, and Marcus realized that, ready or not, they were committed to this path. There would be no rescue, no last-minute arrival of medical professionals, no easy way out. He looked at Catherine and Nicole, saw his own determination reflected in their faces, and felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in 2 decades, Marcus Whitfield was no longer alone with his grief. The question now was whether he was strong enough to help bring a new life into the world without destroying what remained of his own carefully constructed defenses. The contractions were now coming every 2.5 minutes, each one more intense than the last. Marcus knelt beside his own bed, watching Julia's face contort with pain while her sisters flanked her on either side. The intimacy of the moment struck him like a physical blow. He hadn't been this close to another human being, let alone a woman in labor, since Rebecca's final pregnancy scare 3 months before the accident. "I need to check your progress," Marcus said quietly, his voice steadier than his hands. "Catherine, can you help position some towels for privacy?" As Catherine arranged the clean linens Marcus had provided, Julia grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "What if something goes wrong?" she whispered, her green eyes wide with terror. What if the baby comes too fast or gets stuck or the cord is wrapped around his neck? Marcus felt his throat constrict. These were the exact fears that had plagued Rebecca during her pregnancies, the nighttime conversations that had ended, with him holding her close and promising everything would be fine. But promises were dangerous things, as he'd learned when his own world had shattered in 17 seconds of twisted metal and broken glass. "We'll handle whatever comes," he said instead, meeting Julia's gaze with hard-won honesty. One step at a time. The examination revealed what Marcus had already suspected. Julia was dilated to 7 centimeters and progressing rapidly. The baby's head was properly positioned, and he could feel the tiny skull through the thin membrane that separated the child from the outside world. "Everything looks normal," he announced, pulling his hands back and accepting the clean towel. Nicole offered, "You're in active labor, probably 3 to 4 hours from delivery, maybe less if things continue moving this quickly." Catherine released a breath she'd been holding. 3 to 4 hours. We can do this. "What about the storm?" Nicole asked, glancing toward the window where rain continued to lash against the glass. "Any chance it'll clear up so we can get Julia to a real hospital?" Marcus shook his head grimly. "This system is supposed to last until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. The bridge won't be passable for at least 12 hours after the rain." Stops, assuming it's still structurally sound. Julia let out a low moan as another contraction built. Marcus found himself automatically reaching for her hand, then stopping abruptly when he realized what he was doing. Physical comfort, human touch, these were things he'd deliberately purged from his life. But the woman on his bed was in pain, and every instinct he'd thought was dead was screaming at him to help. "It's okay," Julia gasped, seeing his hesitation. "Please, I need to hold on to something." Marcus allowed her to grip his fingers, and the contact sent an electric shock through his system. Her skin was warm, alive, desperate, everything his isolated existence had been designed to avoid. But as her nails dug into his palm during the contraction's peak, he found he couldn't pull away. "Tell me about your husband," Marcus said when the contraction passed, desperate to fill the silence with something other than his own thundering heartbeat. "Where's he stationed?" Julia's face softened immediately. "Afghanistan. He's a communication specialist with the 82nd Airborne. This is his second deployment, but his first time missing something this big." She touched her swollen belly protectively. "I record voice messages for him every day, talking to the baby, telling David about doctor appointments and how I'm feeling. It's stupid, but I pretend he's here sometimes." "That's not stupid," Catherine said fiercely. "That's love." Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He remembered Rebecca doing similar things during her pregnancies. Talking to her belly, playing classical music, reading stories aloud to the babies before they were born. She'd insisted the twins could hear her voice, that they'd recognize it when they arrived. "Have you chosen a name?" Nicole asked, clearly trying to keep Julia's mind off the pain. "David Jr. if it's a boy, Emma Rose if it's a girl," Julia replied, then caught herself looking at Marcus. "I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm telling you all this. You probably don't care about—" "Emma's a beautiful name," Marcus interrupted, his voice rougher than intended. "It means universal or whole. Good choice." What he didn't say was that Emma had also been his daughter's name, that hearing it spoken aloud felt like being stabbed with a rusty blade. Julia was watching him with curious eyes, as if she sensed there was more to his reaction than simple politeness. Another contraction hit before she could ask questions, and Marcus found himself slipping back into crisis mode. He'd read enough medical texts over the years to know the signs of a normal labor progression, but reading about childbirth and actually managing one were vastly different experiences. "Catherine, I need you to time the contractions precisely," he instructed. "Nicole, keep the water hot and find me the sharpest, cleanest knife I have. We'll need to sterilize it in case we have to cut the umbilical cord." Nicole nodded and headed for the kitchen, but Catherine remained focused on her sister. "Jules, remember those breathing exercises from your prenatal classes? The ones David made you practice every night?" Julia tried to follow her sister's coaching, but Marcus could see exhaustion beginning to take its toll. Labor was physically demanding under the best circumstances, and these were far from ideal conditions. "How long has it been since you've eaten?" Marcus asked. "This morning," Julia admitted. "I was too nervous about the drive to have lunch." Marcus cursed under his breath. A woman in labor needed energy, and Julia had been running on empty for hours. "Nicole," he called toward the kitchen, "bring some of that honey and mix it with a warm water. Julia needs sugar." As Nicole prepared the makeshift energy drink, Marcus found himself studying the three sisters more closely. Their family dynamic was fascinating in its complexity. Catherine clearly functioned as the protective older sister, taking charge and making decisions. Nicole appeared to be the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over tensions and kept everyone focused on solutions rather than problems. Julia, despite being in labor, seemed to be the emotional center of the group, the one the others rallied around. It reminded him painfully of his own family structure. He and Rebecca had been partners in everything, but she'd been the heart of their household, while he'd been the practical problem solver. Emma had been their little leader, always organizing games and adventures for Sophie, who'd been content to follow her twin's guidance. "Marcus," Catherine said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" He tensed, knowing instinctively that whatever she wanted to know would be something he didn't want to answer. "Go ahead." "Have you really been living up here alone for 20 years? No family, no friends, no contact with the outside world?" "Something like that," Marcus replied evasively. "That's not really living," Nicole said from the kitchen doorway, her young voice carrying surprising wisdom. "That's just existing." Marcus felt his jaw clench. "Sometimes existing is enough." "But you clearly know about childbirth, about medical care," Catherine pressed. "You move around this cabin like someone who's used to taking care of people. Were you a doctor? A nurse? A paramedic?" "I was a contractor," Marcus said curtly. "I built houses. Contractors don't usually know how to deliver babies," Julia pointed out between contractions. The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain on the roof and Julia's labored breathing. Marcus realized he'd reached a crossroads. He could continue deflecting their questions and maintain his emotional distance, or he could acknowledge the elephant in the room and admit that his knowledge came from personal experience. "I have 2 daughters," he said finally, the words feeling like gravel in his throat. I had 2 daughters. The past tense hung in the air like smoke. Catherine's eyes widened with understanding, and Nicole's hand flew to her mouth. Julia, even through her pain, seemed to grasp the significance of what he'd revealed. "I'm sorry," Catherine said softly. "I shouldn't have pushed." "They were twins," Marcus continued, surprised to find himself talking. "Emma and Sophie, born 8 weeks early after Rebecca, my wife, developed preeclampsia. I spent 6 weeks in the NICU with them, learning everything I could about infant care, about medical emergencies, about what could go wrong." He paused, struggling with how much to reveal. "They were 8 when they died. Car accident. Rebecca too." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus braced himself for the inevitable expressions of sympathy, the platitudes about time healing all wounds, the uncomfortable attempts to relate his loss to their own experiences. Instead, Julia reached for his hand again. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For telling us, for trusting us with that." Her grip tightened as another contraction began. "And for using what you learned to help me now." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the wall he'd built around his heart. These women weren't treating his revelation as an opportunity to offer empty comfort or probe for more details. They were simply acknowledging his loss and moving forward with the business at hand. "The contractions are getting stronger," Catherine observed, checking her watch. 2 minutes apart now." Marcus nodded, forcing himself to focus on the present rather than the ghosts that seemed to be crowding the room. "We're entering the transition phase. This is usually when things get intense." As if summoned by his words, Julia was hit with a contraction that made her previous pain seem mild by comparison. She cried out, a primal sound that seemed to echo off the cabin walls, and Marcus felt every muscle in his body tense with remembered. "A terror!" "Something's wrong," Julia gasped when the contraction passed. "That felt different, sharper, like something's tearing." Marcus's blood ran cold. He'd read about the complications that could arise during rapid labor, cervical lacerations, uterine rupture, placental abruption. Without proper medical equipment, any of these could be fatal for both mother and child. "I need to examine you again," he said, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "Right now." As Catherine and Nicole positioned themselves to help, Marcus found himself face to face with the terrible irony of his situation. He'd spent 20 years running from the possibility of loss, only to find himself in a position where his actions, or inactions, could determine whether 3 people lived or died. The examination revealed that Julia was now fully dilated, but the baby's position had shifted slightly. What had been a normal head-down presentation was now showing signs of what obstetricians called asynclitic presentation. The baby's head was tilted at an angle that could make delivery significantly more complicated. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing through options. In a hospital, this would be manageable with the right equipment and expertise. In a mountain cabin during a storm, with only basic supplies and his limited knowledge, it could be a disaster. "What is it?" Catherine demanded, reading his expression. "What's wrong?" Marcus looked at the 3 sisters. Catherine's fierce protectiveness, Nicole's wide-eyed trust, Julia's exhausted vulnerability, and realized he was standing at the edge of an abyss. He could tell them the truth about the complications he'd detected and watch their hope crumble. Or he could lie and pray that 20 years of reading medical texts would be enough to get them through. Either choice felt like a betrayal of the trust they'd placed in him. "The baby's position has shifted," he said carefully. "It's not ideal, but it's not necessarily dangerous. We just need to be prepared for a longer, more difficult delivery than we originally anticipated." Julia's face went pale. "How much more difficult?" Marcus met her eyes, seeing Rebecca's fear reflected there, feeling the weight of promises he couldn't make. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm not giving up on you, on any of you." Outside, thunder crashed like the sound of worlds colliding, and Marcus Whitfield prepared to fight for the lives of 3 strangers who had already begun to matter more than his carefully constructed isolation. The next hour tested every limit Marcus thought he understood about himself. Julia's contractions had evolved from painful to devastating, each wave seeming to tear through her small frame with relentless force. The baby's shifted position meant that what should have been a straightforward delivery had become a dangerous gamble with lives he'd never intended to be responsible for. "I need to push," Julia gasped during a brief respite between contractions. "I can't fight it anymore. The pressure is too much." Marcus felt his heart rate spike. Pushing with an asynclitic presentation could lead to shoulder dystocia, a condition where the baby's shoulders became trapped after the head was delivered. He'd read about it in the medical texts he'd obsessively studied after his own daughter's difficult births, but reading and experiencing were universes apart. "Not yet," he said firmly, his hands hovering over her abdomen. "We need to try to help the baby rotate into the right position first." "How?" Catherine demanded. She'd been growing more agitated as Julia's pain intensified, her protective instincts warring with her helplessness. Marcus's mind raced through the techniques he'd read about: manual rotation, positional changes, counter-pressure methods that might encourage the baby to shift, but all of them required a level of expertise he wasn't sure he possessed. "Julia, I need you to get on your hands and knees," he said, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. Sometimes gravity and positioning can help the baby turn. With Catherine and Nicole's help, Julia managed to shift positions despite her exhaustion. The movement triggered another fierce contraction, and Marcus watched her knuckles go white as she gripped the headboard of his bed. "This is insane," Nicole whispered, her young face pale with fear. "She needs a real doctor, not someone who learned about childbirth from books." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he couldn't argue with their accuracy. He was flying blind, relying on 20-year-old memories and theoretical knowledge, while 3 women's lives hung in the balance. "Tell me about your NICU experience," Catherine said suddenly, her tone sharp with the authority of someone used to extracting information under pressure. "You mentioned 6 weeks with your daughters. What exactly did you learn?" Marcus found himself grateful for the distraction as Julia endured another contraction. "Everything," he said simply. "When your children are born 8 weeks premature, you become an expert in infant resuscitation, respiratory distress, feeding complications, infection control. The nurses taught me to recognize signs of trouble, how to monitor vital signs, emergency interventions, including delivery complications, especially delivery complications," Marcus confirmed. "Premature babies often have difficult births. I watched cesarean sections, assisted with NICU admissions, learned to spot the signs of oxygen deprivation, cord prolapse, hemorrhage." Julia raised her head, sweat streaming down her face. "Are you saying my baby might need resuscitation?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I'm saying I'll know what to do if that becomes necessary, but let's focus on getting the baby into the right position first." The positional change seemed to be helping. Marcus could feel the baby's head shifting slightly with each contraction, gradually aligning with the birth canal, but the process was painfully slow, and Julia's strength was visibly flagging. "I can't do this much longer," she admitted, her voice breaking. "It hurts too much. I'm too tired." Nicole moved to her sister's side, brushing damp hair away from Julia's forehead. "Remember what Mom used to say when we were kids and thought we couldn't do something hard?" Julia managed a weak smile. "You're stronger than you know, braver than you feel, and more loved than you realize." "That's right," Catherine added, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "And David is going to be so proud of you when he hears about this. His wife, bringing his child into the world during a mountain storm with nothing but determination and love." Marcus watched the sisters support each other and felt an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the physical demands of the situation. This was what family looked like: messy, fierce, uncompromising love that endured through crisis. It was what he'd lost 20 years ago, what he'd convinced himself he could live without. "Marcus," Julia said suddenly, her voice urgent, "something's different. The pressure is moving down. I think the baby's turning." Marcus positioned himself to examine her again, and his heart leapt with relief. The baby's head had rotated into proper alignment, the asynclitic presentation correcting itself through patience and positioning. "That's it," he breathed. "The baby's in the right position now. Julia, with the next contraction, you can start pushing." The transformation in the room was immediate. Catherine grabbed Julia's hand, Nicole positioned herself with towels and warm water, and Marcus prepared himself for the final phase of a delivery he'd never imagined he'd be conducting. "Wait," Julia said suddenly, panic flashing in her eyes. What if I can't do this? What if I push wrong or something goes wrong or... Hey, Marcus interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. Look at me. When she met his gaze, he continued, 23 years ago, I sat in a delivery room and watched my wife bring 2 babies into the world. She was scared too, convinced she wasn't strong enough, wasn't ready. But you know what I learned that night? Julia shook her head, transfixed by his words. Women's bodies know how to do this. You've carried this baby for 9 months, protected him, nourished him, prepared him for this moment. Your body knows exactly what to do. Trust it. Trust yourself. The next contraction built like a tide, and Julia bore down with a primal intensity. That seemed to surprise even her. Marcus could see the baby's head beginning to crown, dark hair visible in the birth canal. I can see the head, he announced, his voice cracking with emotion he hadn't felt in decades. Julia, your baby has hair. Dark. Hair like yours, Nicole. Nicole burst into tears, whether from relief or overwhelming emotion. Marcus couldn't tell. Catherine squeezed Julia's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. One more push like that, Marcus encouraged. The head is almost out, but as the next contraction peaked, Marcus saw something that made his blood freeze. The umbilical cord was wrapped around the baby's neck, not tightly, but present enough to potentially cause problems as the shoulders delivered. He'd read about nuchal cords, knew they occurred in roughly 1/3 of all deliveries. Most of the time they were harmless, but occasionally they could restrict blood flow or make delivery more complicated. What is it? Catherine asked, reading his expression. What's wrong? Marcus made a split-second decision. He could explain the cord situation and add to Julia's stress, or he could handle it quietly and hope for the best outcome. Nothing's wrong, he said, his hands moving with more confidence than he felt. But I need you to push gently with the next contraction, Julia. Small pushes, not big ones. As the contraction built, Marcus carefully worked his finger around the baby's neck, feeling for the cord. It was there, but loose enough that he might be able to slip it over the baby's head as the shoulders delivered. The baby's head emerged fully, and Marcus found himself staring into the tiny, scrunched face of a brand-new human being. The features were delicate but well-formed, and despite the stress of the delivery, the baby's color looked good. The head is out, he announced, his voice thick with wonder. Julia, you're almost done. Working quickly but carefully, Marcus managed to slip the umbilical cord over the baby's head without causing any apparent distress. The shoulders followed with the next push, and suddenly he found himself holding a slippery, squirming infant who immediately began to cry with impressive volume. It's a girl, he said, his words barely audible over the baby's indignant wails. You have a daughter. The cabin erupted in a chaos of tears, laughter, and exclamations of joy. Catherine and Nicole were crying and talking over each other. Julia was sobbing with relief and exhaustion, and Marcus found himself standing in the middle of it all, holding a newborn baby and feeling like he might collapse from the intensity of the moment. Emma Rose Harrison, Julia whispered, reaching for her daughter with trembling hands. Hello, baby girl. I'm your mama. Marcus carefully placed the infant on Julia's chest, his hands shaking as he covered them both with clean towels. The baby's cries softened as she felt her mother's warmth, and Marcus had to turn away as emotion threatened to overwhelm him completely. Marcus, Catherine said softly, thank you. I don't know how to express what you've just done for us. He couldn't respond immediately, his throat too tight with feelings he'd spent 20 years suppressing. Watching Emma Rose take her first breaths, seeing Julia's face transform with maternal love, witnessing the pure joy of the sisters as they welcomed their new family member. It was almost too much for a man who'd convinced himself he no longer deserved to witness life's miracles. We're not finished yet, he managed finally, falling back on practical concerns to steady himself. We need to deliver the placenta and make sure Julia isn't hemorrhaging. But even as he focused on the medical necessities, Marcus couldn't shake the profound shift he felt in his chest. For 20 years, he'd lived with the belief that he was cursed to lose everyone he cared about, that loving meant inevitable devastation. Tonight, for the first time since the accident, he'd been present, for a beginning instead of an ending. He'd helped bring life into the world instead of mourning its absence, and despite every instinct screaming at him to retreat back into isolation, Marcus found himself reluctant to let this moment end. Baby Emma Rose had arrived safely, but Marcus sensed that her birth had delivered more than just a new life. It had cracked open something in him that 20 years of solitude couldn't repair, something that whispered dangerous possibilities about connection, trust, and the chance that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to spend the rest of his life alone with his grief. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Marcus's cabin, warmth and light seemed to fill every corner as three sisters welcomed the newest member of their family into the world. And in that warm glow, Marcus Whitfield began to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own carefully constructed isolation. The placenta delivered cleanly 20 minutes after Emma Rose's arrival, and Marcus found himself performing tasks he'd only read about, checking for tears that might need attention, monitoring Julia's blood loss, ensuring the baby's breathing remained steady and strong. His hands moved with a competence that surprised him, muscle memory awakening from somewhere deep in his past. "Her breathing sounds perfect," he announced, pressing his ear gently to the baby's tiny chest. "Heart rate is strong. Color is good. She's a healthy little fighter." Emma Rose had settled into that peaceful state that newborns often achieved after the trauma of birth, her small fist curled against her mother's breast, her dark eyes occasionally fluttering open to take in this strange new world. She was impossibly small, maybe 6 pounds, Marcus estimated, but perfectly formed. "She looks like David," Julia whispered, tracing her daughter's features with one finger. "Same nose, same stubborn chin. He's going to fall apart when he sees her pictures." Catherine was already pulling out a cell phone, though Marcus knew it would be useless up here. "We'll get pictures to him as soon as we're back in civilization. He needs to see his daughter." Nicole had appointed herself the cabin's photographer, using an old digital camera she'd found in her bag to document Emma Rose's first moments. The flash illuminated the scene in stark contrast. The rustic log walls, the weathered quilts, the three sisters clustered around the newest member of their family, while Marcus hovered nearby, still not quite believing what had just transpired. "I need to clean her up properly," Marcus said, extending his hands toward the baby, "and we should get her dressed before she gets too cold." Julia hesitated for a moment before handing Emma Rose over, and Marcus felt his breath catch as the infant's weight settled into his arms. It had been 23 years since he'd held a newborn, 23 years since he'd felt that particular combination of fragility and resilience that only babies possessed. Emma Rose opened her eyes as he carried her to the kitchen area where he'd set up a makeshift bathing station. Her gaze seemed to focus on his face with the intense curiosity of the very young, and Marcus found himself talking to her in a voice he'd forgotten he possessed. "There you are, little one," he murmured, using warm water and soft cloths to clean the remnants of birth from her skin. "You gave us quite a scare with that dramatic entrance. Your mama was very brave and your aunts never left her side." "You're a natural with her," Catherine observed, watching from the doorway. "Do you miss it? Having babies around?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd never allowed himself to think about what he'd lost in terms of future grandchildren. Holiday gatherings, the simple joy of watching a family grow and evolve. Those possibilities had died with Emma and Sophie in that twisted wreckage 20 years ago. "I try not to think about what might have been," he said carefully, wrapping Emma Rose in one of his clean flannel shirts since they hadn't anticipated needing infant clothes. "It doesn't serve any purpose." But tonight has to feel different. Nicole pressed gently, being part of bringing a new life into the world instead of just existing up here alone. Marcus finished dressing the baby and lifted her against his shoulder, feeling her settle into the warmth of his body. She was so trusting, so completely dependent, and the responsibility of that trust was both terrifying and oddly healing. "Tonight feels like a lot of things," he admitted. "I'm not sure I'm ready to analyze all of them." When he returned Emma Rose to Julia, the new mother's face was radiant despite her exhaustion. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for not turning us away, for knowing what to do, for staying calm when I was falling apart." "You never fell apart," Marcus corrected. "You were incredible, stronger than most people could ever imagine being." The storm had finally begun to weaken, though rain still drummed steadily against the roof. Marcus checked his weather radio and learned that the system was expected to clear by morning, but road crews wouldn't be able to assess bridge damage until the water levels receded. "Looks like you're my guests for at least another day," he told. "The sisters. Maybe longer, depending on the bridge situation." "Is that going to be a problem?" Catherine asked, studying his face. "We're essentially strangers who've invaded your home and turned your life upside down." Marcus considered the question seriously. 6 hours ago, the thought of having 3 people, 3 women, staying in his cabin would have sent him into a panic. His sanctuary had been violated, his carefully maintained isolation shattered. But looking at Julia cradling her newborn daughter while her sisters fussed over them both, he found the invasion less threatening than he'd expected. "It's not ideal," he said honestly, "but I'm not about to send a woman with a newborn baby out into a storm. We'll manage." What he didn't say was that the thought of being alone again after tonight felt somehow wrong, as if the silence that had been his constant companion for 20 years would now seem empty rather than peaceful. "I should try to contact David," Julia said, looking hopefully at the cell phone Catherine had placed on the bedside table. "He needs to know Emma Rose is here safely." Marcus shook his head. "No cell service up here under the best conditions, and the storm will have knocked out what little coverage exists. We'll have to wait until we can get to town." The disappointment on Julia's face was heartbreaking. Here she was, having just achieved the most monumental experience of her life, and she couldn't share it with the person who mattered most. Marcus found himself wishing he'd maintained some form of communication with the outside world, if only to spare her this particular pain. "Tell me about him," Marcus said impulsively. "About David. What's he like?" Julia's face lit up immediately. He's the kind of man who remembers that I don't like tomatoes on my sandwiches, who learned to braid my hair when I broke my wrist, who sends me pictures of sunsets from Afghanistan because he knows I love watching them." Catherine smiled. He proposed by hiding the ring in a box of her favorite tea. Julia almost threw it away without looking inside. "He's been writing letters to the baby since we found out I was pregnant," Julia continued, her voice soft with love. "One for every month, talking about what he's thinking, what he hopes for Emma Rose's future, stories about his own childhood. I was supposed to give them to her on her first birthday." Marcus felt his throat tighten. It was exactly a kind of thing he would have done, the kind of father he'd been trying to become when everything ended. "He sounds like a good man." "The best," Julia agreed. "He's going to be devastated that he missed this, but he'll be so grateful that you were here. You probably saved both our lives tonight." Marcus wasn't sure about that, but he didn't argue. The truth was, he'd been running on instinct and determination, hoping his limited knowledge would be enough to prevent disaster. The fact that everything had turned out well felt more like luck than skill. As the night wore on, the sisters settled into a routine of caring for Emma Rose and helping Julia recover. Marcus found himself drawn into their circle despite his best intentions, consulted on questions about newborn care, asked to hold the baby while Julia rested, included in conversations about everything from family history to future plans. It was dangerously seductive, this feeling of belonging somewhere, again. For 20 years, his days had been defined by solitude and routine, by the absence of human connection. But tonight, his cabin felt alive with purpose, filled with the kind of warmth that came from people who genuinely cared about each other. "Marcus," Nicole said during a quiet moment when Julia and the baby were both sleeping, "can I ask you something that might be too personal?" He tensed automatically but nodded. "Do you think your wife and daughters would want you to spend the rest of your life alone? Would they want you to cut yourself off from everything good that might still happen?" The question hit him like a sledgehammer. It was something he'd never allowed himself to consider, the possibility that his self-imposed exile was as much a betrayal of Rebecca, Emma, and Sophie's memory as moving on would have been. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've spent so long focused on surviving their absence that I've never thought about what they might want for me." Catherine leaned forward, her expression gentle but intent. "What kind of father were you? What kind of husband?" "I tried to be good at both," Marcus replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "I coached Emma's softball team, built Sophie a dollhouse that took me 3 months to finish. Rebecca and I used to dance in the kitchen while dinner cooked. Even after 8 years of marriage." "Then you know they loved you," Catherine said firmly. "And people who love you want you to be happy, want you to have a full life, even if they can't be part of it." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and guilt that had been his constant companion. "It's not that simple," he protested. "Moving on feels like forgetting them." "Does tonight feel like forgetting them?" Nicole asked quietly. "Or does it feel like honoring what they taught you about love and caring for people?" Before Marcus could answer, Emma Rose began to fuss, and Julia stirred awake to tend to her daughter. As he watched the new mother soothe her baby with instinctive grace, Marcus realized that tonight had indeed felt like honoring something rather than betraying it. He'd used everything his own experience as a father had taught him to help bring this child safely into the world. He'd drawn on the love Rebecca had shown him to extend compassion to 3 strangers. He'd remembered what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own pain. "Maybe you're right," he admitted to the sisters. "Maybe isolation isn't what they would have wanted for me." As dawn began to break through the cabin windows, painting everything in soft gold light, Marcus found himself wondering what other possibilities he'd been too afraid to consider. Emma Rose was sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, and the storm had finally passed, leaving the world washed clean and full of potential. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus Whitfield allowed himself to imagine that his story might not be over after all. The morning light streaming through Marcus's windows revealed the full transformation of his sanctuary. Baby clothes hung drying near the fireplace, improvised from his own flannel shirts and soft cotton undershirts. The kitchen counter was cluttered with bottles for feeding, bowls for washing, and the detritus of caring for a newborn. Most shocking of all, his usually pristine living space buzzed with the comfortable chaos of family life. Julia sat propped against pillows on his couch, Emma Rose nursing contentedly at her breast, while Catherine read aloud from one of Marcus's books, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that he'd read probably 50 times over the years. Nicole had appointed herself breakfast cook, moving around his kitchen with surprising efficiency, despite never having used a wood-burning stove before. "I can't believe you've been living like this for 20 years, Nicole said, flipping what appeared to be very successful pancakes on his cast-iron griddle. "I mean, it's beautiful in a rugged way, but don't you miss things like hot showers and internet and pizza delivery?" Marcus accepted a cup of coffee she'd brewed, better coffee than he'd made for himself in years, and considered the question. "You can't miss what you've trained yourself to forget," he said. "I stopped thinking about convenience when I came up here. The goal was survival, not comfort." "But survival isn't living," Catherine pointed out, echoing Nicole's words from the night before. "What's the point of existing if you're not actually experiencing life?" Before Marcus could formulate a response, Emma Rose finished nursing, and Julia began the process of burping her. Watching the new mother's natural competence, Marcus felt a sharp pang of memory. Rebecca doing the same thing with their twins, her face soft with contentment as she tended to their daughters. "Can I hold her?" he asked impulsively, surprising himself with the request. Julia smiled and carefully transferred the baby to his arms. Emma Rose settled against his chest with a tiny sigh, and Marcus found himself swaying slightly, the motion as natural as breathing, despite the decades that had passed since he'd last held an infant. "You're really good with her," Julia observed. "Were your daughters easy babies?" Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a warmth that came from sharing memories instead of burying them. "Sophie was the easy one," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Slept through the night by 8 weeks, hardly ever fussed. Emma was more spirited. She had opinions about everything from day one." Catherine laughed. "That sounds familiar. I was apparently the difficult baby who never slept while Julia was the angel child." "And Nicole?" Marcus asked, glancing at the youngest sister. "Nicole was the surprise," Julia said with a grin. "Mom and Dad thought they were done after Catherine and me. Then along came this little firecracker 8 years later." Nicole made a face at her sisters, but continued cooking, clearly accustomed to being the target of good-natured family teasing. "For your information, I was a perfectly reasonable baby. It's not my fault you two had set the bar so low." Marcus found himself smiling, actually smiling at their banter. When was the last time he'd been around this kind of easy, affectionate family dynamic? Probably not since his own childhood, visiting his grandparents' farm where multiple generations gathered for holidays and celebrations. "Tell us about your family," Catherine said, settling back into her chair with the book forgotten in her lap. "Before Rebecca and the girls, I mean. Where did you grow up?" The request should have triggered his usual defensive response, the automatic shutdown that had protected him from personal questions for 2 decades. Instead, Marcus found himself thinking about summer afternoons at his grandfather's workshop, the smell of sawdust and the sound of old-fashioned hand tools creating beauty from raw wood. "Small town in Oregon," he said, shifting Emma Rose to his shoulder where she seemed perfectly content to sleep. "My grandfather was a carpenter, taught me everything I know about working with wood. My parents died when I was 16, car accident. So I lived with him until I graduated high school." "Is that where you learned to carve?" Nicole asked, gesturing toward the hundreds of wooden birds that lined his shelves. Marcus nodded. "Granddad carved decoys for hunters, but in the evenings he'd make little animals for the neighborhood kids." Said Whittling kept his hands steady and his mind peaceful. "The birds are incredible," Julia said softly. "Each one is so detailed, so lifelike, you could probably sell them in galleries." The suggestion made Marcus uncomfortable. His carvings weren't art in any commercial sense. They were therapy, meditation, a way to keep his hands busy while his mind wrestled with memories. The idea of selling them felt like a betrayal of their purpose. "They're not for sale," he said firmly. "They're just something to do." Catherine studied his face with the perceptiveness of someone trained to read. "People, what do you do with your time, really, besides carving and basic survival? 20 years is a long time to fill with just staying alive." Marcus considered the question. "How did you explain 2 decades of structured emptiness to people who lived full, connected lives?" "I hunt, fish, maintain the cabin and equipment, read when I can get books, track weather patterns, animal migrations. There's always something that needs repair or attention. But don't you get lonely? Nicole asked, her young voice full of genuine concern. Don't you miss talking to people, sharing experiences, having someone to laugh with or worry about you? The question hit deeper than she probably realized. Loneliness had been Marcus's constant companion for so long that he'd almost stopped recognizing it as a separate entity. It was just part of the landscape of his existence, like the mountains or the changing seasons. Loneliness implies you expect something different, he said carefully. When you accept that solitude is your natural state, it stops feeling like a deficit. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard, Julia said, tears gathering in her eyes. Marcus, you're not meant to be alone. Nobody is. Emma rose, stirred against his shoulder, making the small snuffling noises that newborns produce, and Marcus found himself automatically patting her back in a soothing rhythm. The motion brought another flash of memory. Late nights with Emma, and Sophie walking the floor when they were colicky, feeling like the most important person in the world because he could comfort them when no one else could. I was good at not being alone, he admitted. Maybe too good. When you lose something you were that dependent on, the safest choice is to never risk needing it again. Nicole set a plate of pancakes in front of him, her expression troubled. But that's not really living, that's just existing in fear. Fear, and keeps you safe, Marcus replied, though even as he said it, the words felt less convincing than they had 24 hours ago. Does it, though? Catherine challenged. Has all this isolation actually made you feel safer, or has it just made you feel dead inside? The bluntness of the question should have angered him, but instead it forced him to examine something he'd been avoiding for years. Had 20 years of careful isolation actually healed anything, or had it just frozen him in a state of permanent grief? Looking around his cabin, now filled with life and laughter and the promise of new beginnings, Marcus realized that safety might have been an illusion all along. The pain of loss was still there, would probably always be there, but it had been joined by something else. Emptiness. 20 years of existing without connection, without purpose beyond mere survival, without the possibility of joy or growth or surprise. I used to dream about them, he said suddenly, surprised by his own words. Rebecca, Emma, Sophie. For the first few years I'd dream about them every night. Sometimes good dreams where we were together again. Sometimes nightmares about the accident. But the dreams were contact, proof that they were still real, still part of me. The sisters waited quietly, sensing he needed to continue. The dreams stopped about 10 years ago, just stopped, and I realized one morning that I couldn't remember the exact sound of Rebecca's laugh anymore, couldn't recall the specific way Emma wrinkled her nose when she was thinking hard. I'd succeeded in protecting myself from the pain, but I'd also locked away everything good about loving them. Julia reached over and touched his free hand, her gesture gentle but firm. Maybe that's what tonight was about. Maybe Emma Rose came into your life to remind you that love isn't about the risk of losing, it's about the joy of having. Marcus looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms, her face peaceful and trusting, and felt something shift inside his chest. This child had no idea she'd been born into anything unusual, had no awareness of the emotional earthquake her arrival had triggered in a broken man's carefully ordered existence. What happens when you leave? He asked, the question emerging from somewhere deep and vulnerable. When the bridge is repaired and you drive back to your real lives, what happens to... He gestured around the cabin, unable to articulate exactly what he was afraid of losing. What happens to this feeling? Catherine suggested gently. This sense of being connected to other people again. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. That's Up to you, Nicole said, her tone both compassionate and challenging. You could come with us, visit town, meet people, remember what it's like to be part of the world. The suggestion terrified him more than any storm or wild animal ever had. After 20 years of isolation, the thought of rejoining civilization felt like contemplating a leap off a cliff. I wouldn't know how, he said honestly. I wouldn't know how to talk to people, how to explain where I've been, how to function in a world that's moved on without me. You're talking to us, Julia pointed out. You helped deliver my baby. You're holding her right now like you've been doing it all your life. You haven't forgotten how to connect with people. You've just convinced yourself you had. Emma rose, chose that moment to wake up, her dark eyes opening to focus on Marcus's face with that intense newborn stare that seemed to see straight through to the soul. For a long moment, they regarded each other, the man who'd spent 20 years running from connection, and the child who represented pure possibility. She likes you, Julia said softly. Babies have good instincts about people. Marcus found himself studying Emma Rose's tiny features, memorizing them the way he'd once memorized his own daughter's faces. But this time, instead of the sharp pain of loss, he felt something different. Wonder, gratitude, the fragile beginnings of hope. Maybe, he said quietly, maybe it's time to stop running. The words hung in the air like a promise, and Marcus Whitfield felt 20 years of carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble around him. By mid-afternoon, the weather radio crackled with news that would change everything. The storm system had moved east, but the damage assessment of Highway 7 bridge revealed structural compromise that would require weeks, not days, to repair. The alternate route through Canyon Pass wouldn't be accessible until road crews could clear multiple landslides. Looks like we're stuck here for a while longer, Marcus announced, though his tone carried less resignation than it might have 24 hours earlier. Catherine was pacing near the window, her phone in her hand despite its uselessness, clearly struggling with the implications. I was supposed to be back in Boston for a client presentation on Thursday. Julia has a doctor's appointment scheduled for next week. Nicole has final exams. The world keeps spinning, even when we're not there to push it, Julia said philosophically, adjusting Emma Rose's position as she attempted to nurse again. David used to say that deployment taught him the difference between what feels urgent and what actually matters. Nicole looked up from the medical text she'd been reading, one of several Marcus had accumulated over the years. According to this book, newborns should see a pediatrician within 72 hours of birth for initial screening. Are we going to be able to get to a doctor by then? Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These women had trusted him to deliver their babies safely, but his expertise ended at birth. He had no way to assess whether Emma Rose was developing normally, whether Julia was recovering properly, whether any complications might be developing. There's a retired nurse in Pine Ridge, he said slowly. Margaret Walsh. She used to work in pediatrics before she moved up here. If we could get word to her somehow. How? Catherine asked. You said there's no phone service, no way to communicate with town. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing options he hadn't considered in years. There's an old logging road that connects to the fire service trails. If someone hiked out, and I mean really hiked, 12 miles through rough terrain, they could reach the ranger station at Copper Creek. They maintain radio contact with town. That someone being you, Nicole said, reading his expression. The thought of leaving his mountain sanctuary, even temporarily, even for a medical emergency, triggered every defense mechanism Marcus had built over 20 years. But looking at Emma Rose, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, he realized his comfort mattered less than her well-being. I could make it to Copper Creek by evening if I left now, he said. Radio ahead to have Margaret meet us at the ranger station with medical supplies. Maybe arrange for a helicopter evacuation if the baby needs immediate care. Julia's face went pale. Do you think something's wrong? She seems so healthy, so alert. She seems perfect, Marcus assured her quickly. But Nicole's right about the timing. Newborns need professional medical assessment, especially ones born under less than ideal circumstances. What he didn't say was that his own anxiety was driving the urgency. Every hour that passed reminded him how much could go wrong. With infants, how quickly a perfect baby could become a medical crisis. The twins' premature birth had taught him that babies were simultaneously resilient and fragile, capable of surviving incredible trauma, but vulnerable to complications that could develop without warning. I don't want you hiking 12 miles alone. Through the mountains, Catherine said firmly. What if you get injured? What if something happens to you out there? The concern in her voice surprised Marcus. When was the last time anyone had worried about his safety, his well-being? For 20 years, his survival or death had mattered to no one but himself. I've been hiking these trails for 2 decades, he said. I know every tree, every stream, every potential hazard. If anyone can make it safely, it's me. But why do you have to go alone? Nicole pressed. I'm young, I'm in good shape, I could come with you. Marcus shook his head immediately. Absolutely not. The terrain is dangerous even for experienced hikers, and your sister needs you here. Besides, if something does happen to me, you'd be stranded without anyone who knows how to live up here. The conversation revealed something that both touched and terrified Marcus. These women had begun to depend on him. Not just for shelter or basic survival, but as a protector, a problem solver, someone whose well-being mattered to their own security. It was exactly the kind of responsibility he'd spent 20 years avoiding. There's another option, Julia said, quietly. We wait. Emma Rose seems healthy. My recovery is going well. Maybe we don't need to panic. Marcus studied the baby, noting her color, her breathing, the alertness in her dark eyes. From a medical standpoint, Julia was right. There were no immediate warning signs, no obvious problems that demanded urgent intervention, but there were also no guarantees. Infections could develop rapidly in newborns. Maternal complications could emerge days after delivery, and Marcus was acutely aware of his limitations as a medical provider. What would David want you to do? He asked Julia. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. He'd want Emma Rose to have the best possible care, even if it meant taking reasonable risks to get it. Then I hike out tomorrow at first light, Marcus decided. That gives us tonight to monitor both of you, make sure there are no developing complications. If everything still looks good in the morning, I'll make contact with town and arrange for proper medical care. Catherine nodded reluctantly. What do we do if something goes wrong while you're gone? If Julia develops fever or the baby shows signs of distress? Marcus felt his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. This was why isolation had felt safer. No one else's life depending on his decisions, no possibility of failing people who trusted him. There's a radio in the emergency kit, he said. It only works from certain high points on the ridge, but if you absolutely need help, you could try to reach the ranger station. The instructions are written on a card taped to the battery compartment. You're scared, Nicole observed, her young face serious. You're as frightened as we are, aren't you? Marcus considered lying, but found he couldn't. These women deserved honesty, especially when they were placing their lives in his hands. Terrified, he admitted. I spent 20 years making sure. I was never responsible for anyone else's well-being. The idea that your lives might depend on decisions I make, it's almost paralyzing. But you're going to do it anyway, Julia said. Not a question, but a statement of certainty. Because it's the right thing to do, Marcus confirmed. Because Emma Rose deserves the best possible start in life, and you deserve proper medical care. And because you care about us, Catherine added softly. Whether you want to admit it or not, you care about what happens to us. The truth of her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Somewhere in the past 36 hours, these three strangers had become important to him. Not just as people in need of help, but as individuals whose well-being mattered to his own emotional landscape. Emma Rose stirred and began to fuss, and Marcus found himself automatically reaching for her. Julia handed her over without hesitation, and the baby settled immediately against his chest. She knows you, Julia said wonderingly. Look how she calms down when you hold her. Marcus looked down at Emma Rose, feeling the warm weight of her small body against his heart. She was so trusting, so completely vulnerable, and the responsibility of that trust was both overwhelming and oddly healing. I used to hold Emma and Sophie like this, he said quietly, when they were fussy or sick or just needed comfort. Rebecca used to say I had magic hands that the babies could sense when I was calm, and it made them feel safe. You do, Nicole said. Have magic hands, I mean. Look at her. She's completely content. Marcus studied Emma Rose's peaceful face and realized something profound was happening to him. For the first time in 20 years, he was allowing himself to form an attachment to another human being. Despite every instinct screaming at him to maintain emotional distance, he was beginning to care about this baby, about her mother, about her aunts. It was terrifying and wonderful, and completely contrary to everything he'd built his survival around. What if I can't do it? He asked suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. What if I hike out tomorrow and something goes wrong while I'm gone? What if I make the wrong decision and someone gets hurt? Catherine leaned forward, her expression gentle but firm. What if you don't try and something goes wrong anyway? What if playing it safe is actually the most dangerous choice? 20 years ago, I made decisions that got my family killed, Marcus said, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside him. I chose to drive home in bad weather instead of staying at the job site. I took a route I'd driven 1,000 times. Instead of taking the highway, I decided to surprise the girls with circus tickets instead of just going straight home. The sisters were silent, understanding that he was sharing something fundamental about his self-imposed exile. If I'd made different choices, if I'd been more cautious, more careful, they'd still be alive, Marcus continued, his voice breaking. So I came up here and spent 20 years making sure my choices couldn't hurt anyone else. Julia shifted Emma, rose to one arm, and reached out to take Marcus's hand with the other. But your choices didn't kill them. A drunk driver killed them. You were just a man trying to surprise his daughters. The result was the same. The result was a tragedy, Catherine corrected firmly. But trauma doesn't equal fault, Marcus. You survived something horrible, and instead of healing, you punished yourself for 20 years. Marcus felt tears he'd been holding back for 2 decades beginning to fall. Emma Rose opened her eyes and stared up at him with that intense newborn focus, as if she could see straight through to his wounded soul. I don't know how to stop being afraid, he admitted. I don't know how to make decisions when other people's lives are at stake, the same way you delivered Emma Rose, Nicole said quietly, one step at a time, trusting that love matters more than fear. Marcus looked around the cabin at these 3 women who had invaded his isolation and somehow managed to crack open his heart. Tomorrow he would leave them, would venture back into a world he'd abandoned 20 years ago, would risk everything he'd built on the chance that Emma Rose deserved better than his fear. It was the first truly brave thing he'd contemplated doing since the night he'd buried his family, and as Emma Rose yawned and settled back to sleep in his arms, Marcus Whitfield began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to start living again instead of just surviving. Marcus woke before dawn, his internal clock as precise as it had been for 20 years. But this morning felt different, charged with purpose and paralyzed by terror in equal measure. Outside his window, the forest was draped in pre-dawn mist, the world holding its breath as he prepared to leave his sanctuary for the first time in over a decade. The sisters were still sleeping, Julia curled protectively around Emma Rose on the couch. Catherine stretched across the armchair with a quilt tucked around her shoulders, Nicole bundled on the makeshift bed they'd created from cushions and blankets. The sight of them filling his space with their peaceful presence sent an unexpected pang through his chest. Moving quietly, Marcus began his preparations for the hike to Copper Creek. His backpack, unused for years except for short hunting trips, felt foreign as he loaded it with emergency supplies. Water, first aid kit, flares, emergency shelter, the old radio that might work if he could reach the right elevation. His movements were automatic, muscle memory from his early days on the mountain when he'd been less certain of his ability to survive in isolation. "You're leaving without saying goodbye," Julia's voice made him freeze. She was sitting up on the couch, Emma Rose cradled against her chest, both of them watching him with alert eyes despite the early hour. "I didn't want to wake anyone," Marcus said softly. "You need rest, and I need to cover as much ground as possible before the heat of the day." "That's not why," Julia said with the gentle perceptiveness that reminded him so much of Rebecca. "You're afraid that saying goodbye will make it real, that you're actually leaving us." The accuracy of her observation was unsettling. Marcus had been moving through his preparations with the mechanical efficiency he'd perfected over 2 decades, deliberately avoiding the emotional weight of what he was about to do. "I'm coming back," he said, the words sounding like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "Are you?" Julia asked. "Or are you thinking that once you're out there, once you remember what the world feels like, you might decide it's easier to just keep walking?" The question hit too close to home. The truth was, Marcus had no idea what would happen once he left the mountain. 20 years of isolation couldn't be undone in 48 hours, no matter how profound the experience had been. The thought of rejoining civilization, of dealing with people and questions, and the overwhelming complexity of modern life made his chest tight with anxiety. "I won't abandon you," he said finally. "Whatever happens out there, I'll make sure you get the medical care you need." Catherine stirred in her chair, opening eyes that were immediately alert. "How long should we expect you to be gone?" Marcus checked his watch. 5:30 a.m. 12 miles to Copper Creek, assuming no complications. If I maintain a good pace, I should reach the ranger station by mid-afternoon. Time to radio town, coordinate with Margaret Walsh, possibly arrange helicopter transport depending on what resources are available. Best case scenario, I'm back by tomorrow evening with help. Worst case scenario? Nicole asked, now awake and sitting up among her makeshift bedding. I don't make it to Copper Creek before dark and have to overnight on the trail. That pushes everything back a day. Marcus didn't voice the other worst-case scenarios: injury, getting lost, equipment failure, or the possibility that 20 years of mountain living hadn't prepared him for a 12-mile trek under pressure. Emma Rose began to fuss, and Marcus found himself moving automatically toward the couch. Julia handed him the baby without hesitation, and he felt that now familiar sense of rightness as the infant settled against his chest. "She's going to miss you," Julia said, watching them together. "Look how she responds to your voice, to your touch. She knows you're her rescuer." Marcus looked down at Emma Rose, memorizing her tiny features, the weight of her body, the sound of her breathing. In less than 3 days, this child had become as precious to him as his own daughters had been. The thought of anything happening to her while he was gone was almost unbearable. "Tell me again about David," he said suddenly. "About what kind of father he wants to be." Julia's face softened immediately. "He talks about teaching her to fish, to throw a baseball, to change the oil in her car. But mostly he talks about being present, really present, for all the small moments. He says deployment taught him that life is made up of ordinary days, and missing them is the real tragedy. Smart man, Marcus said, thinking about all the ordinary days he'd missed with Emma and Sophie after their 8th birthday. All the moments that would never happen because of 17 seconds of twisted metal and bad decisions. He'd like you, Catherine said with certainty. David respects men who take responsibility, who step up when things get difficult. What you're doing for us, risking your own safety to get help, that's exactly the kind of man he is. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He'd spent 20 years defining himself as someone who ran from responsibility, who couldn't be trusted with other people's well-being. But these women saw him differently, saw strength where he saw cowardice, courage where he saw fear. I should go, he said reluctantly, handing Emma Rose back to Julia. Every hour I delay is an hour longer before you can get proper medical care. Nicole stood and walked to the kitchen, returning with a thermos of coffee and several wrapped parcels. Breakfast for the trail, she said simply, and something to remember that you have people waiting for you to come back. The gesture was so unexpectedly touching that Marcus had to clear his throat before speaking. Thank you, all of you, for trusting me, for... He struggled to find words for what they'd given him, for reminding me what it feels like to matter to someone. Catherine rose and, before Marcus could react, wrapped him in a fierce hug. You matter to us, she said firmly, more than you know. So you be careful out there and you come back safe. Nicole joined the embrace, and then Julia, careful not to jostle the baby, added her arms to the group. For a moment, Marcus was surrounded by warmth and acceptance and the kind of human connection he'd forgotten existed. It was terrifying and wonderful, and exactly what he'd been running from for 20 years. I'll be back, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I promise. The trail to Copper Creek was more challenging than Marcus remembered. Years of maintaining only the paths immediately around his cabin had left him somewhat unprepared for the sustained effort required to cover 12 miles of mountain terrain. By the time he'd hiked 3 miles, his legs were burning and his breathing was labored in a way that concerned him. But more challenging than the physical demands was the psychological weight of leaving his sanctuary. Every step away from the cabin felt like a betrayal of the safety he'd built. Every mile covered brought him closer to a world he no longer understood or trusted. The forest around him was awakening to full day. Birds calling from the canopy, squirrels chattering their territorial disputes, the creek running full from recent rains. It was the same wilderness he'd lived in for 20 years, but viewed through the lens of his mission, it felt different, less like home and more like an obstacle between him and help for the people who now depended on him. At the 4-mile mark, Marcus stopped to rest and check his progress. The trail was well marked and his navigation was solid, but the pace was slower than he'd hoped. The realization that he might not reach Copper Creek until evening sent a spike of anxiety through his system. What if Julia developed complications while he was gone? What if Emma Rose showed signs of distress? What if his decision to seek help ended up causing more harm than good? The doubts that had plagued him for 2 decades came roaring back with vengeance. This was why isolation was safer. When you didn't care about anyone, you couldn't make the wrong choice for them. When you weren't responsible for anyone's well-being, you couldn't fail them in critical moments. But then, he thought about Emma. Rose's tiny hand wrapped around his finger, about Julia's trust as she handed him her newborn daughter, about the way all 3 sisters had looked to him for guidance and protection. They'd seen something in him that he'd lost sight of: competence, reliability, the capacity to care for others. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe his 20 years of self-doubt were more accurate than their faith in his abilities. But they deserved his best effort regardless. Marcus shouldered his pack and continued hiking. By noon, he'd covered 8 miles and was making better time than expected. The trail had leveled out somewhat, following an old logging road that wound through stands of Douglas fir and pine. His legs had found their rhythm, and his breathing had settled into the steady pattern of sustained effort. More importantly, his mind had begun to quiet. The repetitive motion of walking, the familiar sights and sounds of the forest, the clear purpose driving every step, it all combined to create a meditative state he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, since the sisters' arrival, Marcus found himself thinking clearly about his future. Not just the immediate crisis of getting medical help for Emma Rose, but the larger question of what came next. He couldn't go back to pure isolation. The past 3 days had proven that. The loneliness that had felt like solitude now felt like self-imposed prison. The safety he'd built from avoiding human connection now seemed more like cowardice than wisdom, but he also couldn't imagine simply rejoining the world as if the past 20 years hadn't happened. He was 55 years old, had no recent employment history, no social connections, no experience with the technology and changes that had undoubtedly transformed society while he'd been hiding in the mountains. The ranger station at Copper Creek appeared through the trees just as the afternoon sun reached its peak. Marcus felt a surge of relief and accomplishment. He'd made better time than anticipated, and his body had handled the exertion better than he'd feared. But as he approached the small log building, he also felt the return of social anxiety that had been his constant companion in the early days of isolation. How long had it been since he'd had a conversation with anyone other than the sisters? How would he explain his situation without sounding like a crazy hermit? Ranger Tom Bradley was alone in the station, a man about Marcus's age with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent his career in the outdoors. His reaction to seeing a stranger emerge from the wilderness was professionally cordial, but clearly curious. "Afternoon," Bradley said, rising from his desk. "You look like you've been hiking hard. Everything all right?" Marcus realized he probably looked exactly like what he was. A mountain man who just covered 12 miles of difficult terrain on an emergency mission. His clothes were sweat-stained, his face flushed from exertion, his eyes carrying the urgency that had driven him down from his cabin. "I need to use your radio," Marcus said, his voice rustier than usual from disuse with strangers. "Medical emergency. Woman gave birth 2 days ago, needs pediatric care for the baby." Bradley's expression shifted immediately to professional concern. "Where? Are they in immediate danger?" "My cabin, about 12 miles up the Pine Ridge Trail. Mother and baby are stable, but the newborn needs proper medical evaluation. Bridge on Highway 7 is out, no way to get them to town by vehicle." "Jesus," Bradley muttered, reaching for his radio equipment. "Why didn't you radio from the cabin? Emergency frequencies should reach here from Pine Ridge." "No radio at the cabin," Marcus said simply, not explaining that he'd deliberately avoided all communication equipment as part of his isolation strategy. Bradley gave him a sharp look but didn't pursue the topic. "What's your name? I need to file." "An incident report." Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second. Giving his name would create an official record, would mark the end of his anonymous existence. But Emma Rose's well-being mattered more than his privacy. "Marcus Whitfield," he said clearly. "The mother is Julia Harrison, baby girl born approximately 48 hours ago during the storm." As Bradley began working the radio, contacting town services and coordinating rescue efforts, Marcus felt 20 years of isolation finally coming to an end. Whether he was ready or not, Marcus Whitfield was about to rejoin the world. The question now was whether the world and the people waiting for him at his cabin would be there when he returned. The helicopter's rotors beat a steady rhythm against the mountain air as it lifted off from the clearing near Marcus's cabin, carrying Julia, Emma Rose, and medical personnel toward the hospital in Spokane. Marcus watched until it disappeared beyond the ridge, feeling an emptiness that had nothing to do with the return to solitude and everything to do with watching people he cared about leave his life. Margaret Walsh, the the retired pediatric nurse, had pronounced Emma Rose perfectly healthy after a thorough examination. Julia's recovery was progressing normally, with no signs of infection or complications. The emergency that had driven Marcus down the mountain had resolved itself with the best possible outcome. So why did he feel like something essential was ending rather than beginning? Catherine and Nicole had opted to stay behind, while Julia and the baby were transported to the hospital. "Someone needs to help you clean up this disaster," Catherine had said with a wry smile, gesturing at the cabin's transformation from sterile hermitage to family home. But Marcus suspected their real reason was concern about leaving him alone after 3 days of intense human connection. "The helicopter will be back for us tomorrow," Nicole said, already beginning to fold the makeshift baby clothes they'd created from Marcus's shirts. "Julia wants to spend 1 night in the hospital for observation, just to be safe." Marcus nodded, moving automatically to help with the cleanup. But his mind was elsewhere. Tomorrow the sisters would return to their normal lives, Catherine to her client presentation in Boston, Nicole to her final exams in Missoula, Julia to her new life as a single mother waiting for her husband's return from deployment, and Marcus would return to, what? The same isolation that had defined his existence for 20 years, the same routine of hunting, carving, and avoiding human connection. After experiencing what it felt like to matter to people, to be needed, to be part of something larger than his own grief? "You're thinking about what comes next," Catherine observed, her ability to read his expressions still uncanny. "I'm thinking about what doesn't come next," Marcus replied honestly. 3 days ago, I had a clear understanding of who I was and how I wanted to live. Now everything feels complicated, Nicole suggested gently. "Possible," Marcus said, the word surprising him with its accuracy. For 20 years, possibility felt dangerous, hope felt like a betrayal. But now, Catherine sat down at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten solitary meals for 2 decades, now forever changed by the memory of family conversations and shared laughter. "Now, you remember what you're living for instead of what you're hiding from." Before Marcus could respond, the radio crackled to life. Ranger Bradley's voice filled the cabin. "Marcus, you there? Got some follow-up information about your guests." Marcus keyed the microphone, still unused to the sound of another person's voice, addressing him directly. "I'm here, Tom. What's the word?" "Hospital confirms mother and baby are both in excellent health. Doctor wants to keep them overnight as a precaution, but expects full discharge tomorrow. Also got a call from someone claiming to be the baby's father, military overseas, wants to know how to reach his wife." Marcus felt his heart clench. David. Julia's husband, calling from Afghanistan, probably frantic with worry about his wife and the daughter he'd never met. "Can you patch him through?" Marcus asked. "Negative. Communication protocols don't allow direct patching to civilian frequencies. But I can relay messages if you want to coordinate." Marcus looked at Catherine and Nicole, seeing his own emotion reflected in their faces. After everything they'd been through together, after the intimacy of bringing new life into the world, it seemed wrong that David should learn about his daughter's birth through official channels and second-hand reports. "Tell him," Marcus said slowly, "tell him that Emma Rose Harrison was born at 11:23 p.m. on May 15th, weighing approximately 6 pounds. She has dark hair like her mother and her Aunt Nicole, but her stubborn chin is definitely from the Harrison side of the family. She's healthy, beautiful, and already showing signs of her father's strong will." Catherine smiled through tears as Marcus continued. "Tell him that Julia was incredibly brave, that she never stopped talking about how proud he would be, and that she had her sisters with her every moment. She wasn't alone." Nicole grabbed Marcus's hand as he keyed the microphone one final time. "And tell him that Emma Rose had the safest possible birth because her mother's love for him gave her the strength to bring their daughter into the world. under impossible circumstances. The radio was quiet for a moment before Bradley's voice returned, rougher than usual. "Copy that, Marcus. I'll relay every word exactly as you said it." As the radio fell silent, Marcus realized he'd just participated in something he'd avoided for 20 years. The continuation of life, the connection between past and future, the ongoing story of a family that would grow and change and face whatever challenges came next. "That was beautiful," Nicole whispered. "David needed to hear that." "We all needed to hear that," Catherine added, her voice thick with emotion. The afternoon passed quickly as they worked together to restore the cabin to some semblance of its former order, though Marcus knew it would never feel the same. Every corner held memories now. Julia laboring on his bed, Emma Rose sleeping peacefully in his arms, the three sisters supporting each other through crisis and joy. As evening approached, Catherine found Marcus on the front porch, whittling a piece of pine, while he watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and red. "What are you making?" she asked, settling into the chair Nicole had dragged outside earlier. Marcus held up the emerging shape, a small figure of a woman holding a baby, the wood grain flowing naturally with the curves of protective embrace. "Something to remember," he said simply. "You don't need wood to remember us," Catherine said, softly. "We're part of you now, whether you want us to be or not." "I know," Marcus replied. "But I spent 20 years trying to forget the people I loved. I want to make sure I never forget you." Nicole joined them as full darkness settled over the mountain, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the clear sky. It was the kind of moment Marcus had experienced thousands of times in his solitude, but which felt entirely different shared with people who cared about his thoughts and feelings. "I have something to ask you," Catherine said finally, her tone careful and hopeful. "It might be presumptuous, and you should feel free to say no." Marcus tensed, sensing that whatever she was about to propose would challenge his carefully maintained boundaries. "Julia's going to need help when she gets home to Portland," Catherine continued. "David won't be back for another month, and she'll be alone with a newborn in a city where she doesn't have much family support." "You want me to visit her?" Marcus said, understanding immediately where this was heading. "I want you to consider that you have a place in our family now," Catherine said firmly. "Not as an obligation or a charity case, but as someone we care about, someone who matters." "Emma Rose is going to grow up hearing about the mountain man who helped bring her into the world," Nicole added. "Wouldn't it be better if she could actually know you rather than just hearing stories?" Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. They were offering him something he'd never expected to have again: belonging, purpose, a reason to participate in the world instead of just surviving in it. "I don't know how," he said honestly. "I don't know how to be around people anymore, how to navigate relationships, how to be part of someone's life without somehow damaging it." "The same way you delivered Emma Rose," Catherine said, echoing Nicole's words from days earlier, one step at a time, trusting that love matters more than fear. "Besides," Nicole added with a grin, "you've already proven you can handle the hard parts. Compared to delivering a baby during a mountain storm, normal family life should be easy." Marcus laughed despite himself, the sound rusty but genuine. "I'm not sure anything about this family qualifies as normal." "No," Catherine agreed. "We're definitely not normal, but we're yours now if you want us." The offer hung in the mountain air like a bridge between two worlds, the isolated existence Marcus had built to protect himself from further loss, and the messy, complicated, wonderful reality of human connection. For 20 years, he'd believed that loving people meant losing them, that attachment led inevitably to devastation. But looking at Catherine and Nicole, thinking about Julia and Emma Rose safely recovering in a hospital bed, Marcus realized he'd been wrong about something fundamental. Love wasn't about avoiding loss. It was about choosing connection despite the risk. It was about deciding that the joy of belonging was worth the pain of potential separation. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "Being yours, I mean, being part of whatever comes next." Nicole launched herself out of her chair to hug him, and Catherine wasn't far behind, as Marcus found himself surrounded by affection and acceptance for the second time in 4 days. He felt 20 years of carefully constructed walls finally crumble completely. "There's just one condition," he said when they separated. The sisters looked at him expectantly. "I get to teach Emma Rose to carve wood when she's old enough. It's a skill that should stay in the family." Catherine's smile was radiant. "I think that can be arranged." 3 months later, Marcus Whitfield stood in the delivery waiting room at Portland General Hospital, holding Emma Rose, while Julia labored to bring David Jr. into the world. The baby had grown from the tiny newborn he'd delivered during a mountain storm into an alert, curious infant who seemed to recognize his voice and settle immediately in his arms. David Harrison, newly returned from deployment, paced nervously nearby while Catherine and Nicole provided the same calming presence they'd offered during Emma Rose's dramatic birth. "You sure you're ready for 2 of them?" Marcus asked David, adjusting Emma Rose's position as she started to fuss. "With you and the sisters as backup?" David grinned, his nervousness tempered by genuine affection for the unusual extended family they'd all become. "I think we can handle anything." When David Jr. arrived, healthy, loud, and bearing an unmistakable resemblance to his father, Marcus felt the same wonder and gratitude he'd experienced on that stormy night in his cabin. But this time, instead of fearing the attachments forming, in his heart, he embraced them completely. As he held both babies while their parents recovered, Marcus thought about the man he'd been just months earlier, isolated, afraid, convinced that his story was over. That man could never have imagined sitting in a hospital room, surrounded by people who considered him family, trusted with the care of children who would grow up calling him Uncle Marcus. Life, Marcus realized, had a way of finding you even when you'd given up looking for it. Love had a way of healing wounds you'd thought were permanent. And sometimes, just sometimes, the end of one story was actually the beginning of another. Outside the hospital windows, the Oregon sun set in brilliant oranges and reds, and Marcus Whitfield, no longer the hermit of Pine Ridge, but a man who'd learned to live again, smiled as he watched over the newest members of his chosen family. Emma Rose opened her dark eyes and looked up at him with the trust that had started it all, and Marcus felt his heart expand with possibilities he'd never dared to dream. The mountain would always be there when he needed solitude, but he would never be alone again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.